You're listening to Ecosysteming, the podcast redefining economic development through the lens of equitable entrepreneurship, 2 decades in the making. Join NC Idea's Tom Rue as he engages with entrepreneurs and experts who are challenging the status quo and driving lasting change.
Welcome, listeners of the Ecosysteming podcast. I am your happy host, Tom Rue, and today I am joined by North Carolina General Assembly Representative Dante Pittman. Mr. Pittman represents the 24th District, which includes, I believe, all of Wilson County and part of Nash County.
That's correct.
Great. Representative Pittman, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Well, I'm so glad to be here. I love the topics that you all are covering, looking to the future and seeing what we can do for North Carolina. So it's a real pleasure to be here.
Well, let's talk about what you're doing for North Carolina. Why don't you bring us all up to speed on District 24? If my homework is correct or accurate, is it a non-majority district?
So that's exactly right. House District 24, this is what I consider to be one of the most competitive places in North Carolina. And I mean that in a multitude of ways. It's not just the fact that it's competitive politically and that we have numerous folks that come from both sides of the aisle, but we're a diverse community. And so this is a community that has a large amount of citizens that are African American. We also have a growing Latino population. And so this is a really interesting place to be from a multitude of positions. And it's an exciting time to be here in this district. Wilson County is booming. I'm also pleased to have a good piece of Nash County and the Sharpsburg area that is on the rise as well. So this is not only a wonderful place to be all the time, but this in particular is a really interesting time to be in this community.
Yeah, my research that I look at the demographic, as you say, I don't think any demographic has a majority, which makes it a very nice cross section, I think, of offering the best of what North Carolina has to offer, all in one district, which is really convenient, and I think probably a reason why you've been successful in winning the seat.
Yeah, well, I remind folks all the time that Wilson County is my home. It's where I was born and raised, and my family has been here. We've traced it back to 4 or 5 generations. So we've seen Wilson County collectively grow and transform. But one of the things that I felt so privileged about is being in this community is the diversity of the folks I got to know, got to meet, and got to grow up with. Sometimes you'll move to certain communities and you get primarily one perspective, and that's just not the case here. And I think it's a strength for us. I think it's what's helped us continue to fuel our growth, and it's something that I'm really proud of.
Yeah, and I would say with good reason, right? It's a very forward-looking perspective, and if you can thread the needle on serving public interest with such a diverse group, I think you're doing something special, and I would say, unfortunately, less common than it should be. But at least kudos to you that you're doing it in that district, and again, North Carolina is better served for it. Speaking of serving, I would be remiss if I didn't first thank you for your service. I think if, again, my data is correct, you're coming up are already 10 years serving the North Carolina Army National Guard.
December will make 10 years for me.
That's fantastic. Congratulations on that accomplishment. That's not insignificant. It's curious that you're celebrating your 10th anniversary in December. In March, I'll be celebrating 10-year anniversary in my role here at NC Idea.
Well, how about that? Yeah, that's one of those cross sections that's really interesting. And I just got back from Fort Stewart, Georgia. We were down there for about 2.5 weeks training. And, every year we come around, I start to wonder, well, is this the time I'm going to hang it up? And somehow they keep me coming back each and every year. And so it's something I'm really proud of. I started when I was at UNC Chapel Hill in college. and we, like I said, December will make 10 years, and I'm really proud of that.
For good reason. And I'm a lot older than you, but back in the day when I could still fit in my uniform, I too made it through college compliments of a 4-year Air Force ROTC scholarship. It really, I like to say tongue in cheek, the two things that prepared me most for being an entrepreneur were service, to my country, and specifically the leadership training that the Air Force instilled in me, and then being a parent raising kids. Because you need both skills, or kind of that acumen from both sides if you're going to successfully grow and run businesses. And I'm so lucky that I had that chance to serve.
Yeah, well, I tell folks all the time when I go into classrooms and speak with our students, I tell them that it is an opportunity that you should not write off, just off the bat. I understand that sometimes there comes a stigma with joining the service, and folks say you're signing, your freedom away. And I tell them that is not the case. And for me, I was born and raised to a single mother. That scholarship that I got through the National Guard helped me get through college and be debt free from college, and also provided me with a pathway to make connections throughout this community, throughout the state. And I tell folks is that it's something that really, number one, it's service that you will always have that sticks with you, friendships, relationships that you'll always maintain, but also it makes good sense. And like you were talking about, you have got to be thinking on your feet and be resourceful when you're in the military. I mean, that is just the nature of the beast because you are there to solve problems.
And there's another thing I would say that's uniquely American about the service is it's giving back, right? It's expressing appreciation for the freedom that we all enjoy and not just taking it for granted. And like you, well, it wasn't single mother, but first generation. So my mother, father, and brother are naturalized citizens, and so they came here as most immigrants with very little resources. So, and my father worked in a factory. Frankly, he had two factory jobs. He worked first shift, second shift, back to back for the first 2 years they lived in this country, and so they couldn't afford to put me through college, but they insisted that their three kids get a college education. And so I was just lucky to understand that I could uh, received this incredible training in return for my college being fully paid for, and just the life experiences that continue to serve me. So I feel blessed to have had that opportunity, as it sounds like you do too. I'm gonna switch gears here. As fascinating as the personal biographical things are, it's funny because this, I think, the first time we ever met, and it's already we have so many things in common. But I have been looking forward to this conversation because I really need somebody to help me better understand, like, the legislative process is a little generic, but, like, when y'all go into session, what does the public not understand? Like, how are legislative priorities set? Maybe we start there, right? Like, who decides at the beginning of a new session, like, we're gonna talk about these three big things, and other equally important things not, or not other things that are equally important. Like, how does that process? Tell us how the sausage is made, Mr. Pittman.
Yes, well, it has been something that I have both enjoyed and at times been incredibly frustrated with because it is not the straightforward process that sometimes we see in the textbooks when we're coming up through school.
I can imagine.
The first thing I will say that I have learned about this process is that nothing happens until it happens, and then everything happens, and it seems like all at once. And people have asked me, do things move slow? Do they move quickly? And, it's a situation that I've observed where things don't move and they're moving incredibly slow until there is just this shot clock, if you will. People are ready to get out of town, or we're coming on the end of session, or there's some other forcing mechanism, and then you are seeing packages just pulled together to get things across the finish line. And so we go from, just this really slow pace to being quick with the trigger. And sometimes that produces good results because we need things done with some expediency. And then sometimes it just pushes you into a mistake. But to get to the larger question of how priorities are shaped and shifted, I would just say that it is just a matter of fact that in each chamber, the leadership of the majority sets the agenda.
Okay.
And so, we have Republican majorities in both the House and the Senate. And whether folks like that or they do not like that, it's just a fact that that is who is setting the agenda. And so oftentimes we will get outreach from citizens that are frustrated. They will say, "Why can't you take this bill, strip it clean, and pass it?" And I said, if I had the power to do that, we would do it in an instant. But as a member and not the speaker or the president pro tem on the Senate side, that is just not a tool that I have at my disposal most of the time. So that's incredibly important to understand because if you're going to be an effective member of a legislative body, you have got to figure out how to work under those circumstances.
And so do those circumstances, and please forgive me, I might be, expressing just stereotype opinions that I hold. I just see everything is so hyper partisan nowadays. I mean, is there genuine, collegial cooperation happening, or is it the worst that we see in our social media, right? Like, it's got to be overrepresented. I'm thinking it has to be overrepresented in the social media.
Most of the time, that is overrepresented.
Okay.
And that is still something that gives me hope. Like anything else, it depends on the individual that you're working with. I mean, I'm not here to say that they are not partisan members of the General Assembly. And, there are just frankly some folks who are interested in the letter after your name, and that's all they care about. But there are good relationships that exist, and I believe more relationships to be had about how do we get things done. And that is something that I've worked on. I know a number of my colleagues that are in the minority party have been interested in. How do we get some things done that are important for our districts, for our people, but also beneficial to the entire state? Now, the thing about that is that most of the time, those things, you make progress in those relationships when the cameras are off, you're not on the
Hmm.
House floor, you don't see a cell phone. So sometimes nobody will ever know the work that you put into something. But if you can get something across the finish line or make something just a little bit better, I think you have to take pride in that. And that's what public service is. Because, quite frankly, especially a member of my position that represents a district that's very competitive, it's just not good business for the other side to give me a lot of public wins.
Right.
So you have to try to maneuver and find ways to quietly work to get things done and let good legislation and results, although they may be quiet, let that be the satisfaction.
Yeah, it reminds me of an old adage, blessed are those who plant trees under whose shade they will never sit.
Yeah.
And I think that's like if you are in public service or a public facing organization, kind of like we are in what we do to help, high potential entrepreneurship in the state flourish, and in particularly for historically underserved or marginalized groups. A lot of this stuff, well, at least again, I'm old, so like I'll be, off playing shuffleboard somewhere before a lot of this stuff gets, to fruition. But if you have the faith that, you're doing it for a higher purpose or cause, then I don't know, that kind of charges my batteries and gets me through the day.
Well, can I really quickly just tell you this story? And part of the reason why we ended up, me and my wife, signing up for this and running in this campaign is that we were trying to decide if this is something we were going to do. You know, like I said, a competitive race. At that time, she was my fiance. We weren't even married yet. And we were trying to figure this whole thing out. And we got a call from Rock Ridge, North Carolina. And some of your listeners may know the significance of that place. That's the home of Governor Hunt. And so we found ourselves on the couch of Governor and Mrs. Hunt, and we were talking about and weighing the options. And he cut me off and he said, North Carolina is a worthwhile project.
Wow.
And when you hear that from the governor, that pretty much sets you straight.
How do you say no to that?
Exactly. Exactly.
Right. Well, in your case, you don't.
Exactly.
And yeah, and it was like, I think it was what, about 1,000 votes was the margin in your election?
918.
918. So yeah, that's, you know what? I love that story. And it's a good reminder that we can all choose to serve a higher purpose. Because, at the end of the day, that's what's going to leave a legacy worth leaving, and you were saying the secret is figuring out how to get things done. So let me ask you then, and just think of me as, a member of the electorate. How do you think someone should measure the success of a legislative body? Like, it seems like we've lost track of what the coin of the realm is. And, from your perspective, I mean, forgive me, I should have asked earlier, like, is this your first time holding office?
It is.
So you have had a crash education, right? And I'm sure you had certain assumptions going into this that are now different. And I'm not suggesting worse. There's probably a lot of things that are better than what you expected and maybe some negative surprises. I don't know. But like if you're coming into this and you're trying to make the case for why you're the right person, how would should we hold legislative bodies to a certain standard? Can we say like this is the outcome that's worth supporting, or this is the output that we should consider to win or fail? Can you add anything to that?
Yeah, well, first I would say I don't even know that I would call this a standard because really it's a minimum standard, but passing a budget, a comprehensive
Mm,
budget
yeah,
would be a great place to start, and once you do that, then I would argue, you need to judge what that budget does, but not passing a comprehensive budget for the biennium, that is pretty much a signal of failure, and unfortunately, that's where we are right now. We passed a mini budget before we left town, and I was so thankful for that because that had something very important for Wilson Community College, $10 million for our biotech center that's helping to fuel this growth. But that is not the end all be all. We desperately need a budget that addresses some of our issues in terms of public education, transportation, healthcare, housing, and some of these other things. And so, I would say that number one, can we do that collectively? And if not, then the public needs to know, and they need to express how this is just not how government should work. But then number two, the way I judge is what priorities are we funding? Are we funding priorities that are going to make our community stronger and make our state more attractive? And that requires investment sometimes. We don't have great public schools just because we wish to have them. We
right.
have them because we invest in them, we attract high quality teachers, and we make sure our schools are safe. That requires the General Assembly to really make hard choices sometimes, but that's what we're elected to do.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's probably basic truth about any organization, right? Like you have to figure out how you're going to distribute and allocate your resources. I've always said to anybody that cares, if you want to understand the priority of an individual or an organization, or in your case, a governing body, all you have to do is look at two things. How do they allocate their time and how do they allocate their resources? They can say anything they want. I've known people. I've been an entrepreneur for many many years, and I will see these founders that say, "Oh, family first," and it's an admirable sentiment, but like I know they work 70 hours a week on the company, and maybe that's the kind of the barter they've made with themselves, that they've told themselves that to be successful I have to do that, I have to make those sacrifices. But, if the thing you say is the priority receives the last allocation of your time and zero to no allocation of your resources, you you're fooling yourself if you're saying that's an authentic priority in your life. That manifests in how we spend our time and our money. And I think at the state level, the budgetary process is probably the highest expression of that, right? As you said, you can't fund everything.
That's exactly right. I mean, that's exactly right. And unfortunately, what was already a very difficult job has been made harder because of the federal budget that passed, because it has sort of shifted priorities that were funded federally onto the states without a whole lot of time to maneuver. And so that's why, when I sit down at the table and I look at some of these budget proposals that we've had, we essentially have got to look at it and say, what is our basic commitment to North Carolina? And what do we absolutely have to do to make our people stronger and better? And then we have got to be laser focused on that and funding it. And unfortunately, the House and the Senate have not come to an agreement on what that looks like. And depending on your perspective, it might be something that actually causes some surprise in people because it's not a Republican Democratic thing. The House Republicans and the Senate Republicans are both in the majority, and they are not agreeing right now. And so this is one of those rare moments that we talked about before where it does not fall on red or blue lines. It is really
Right.
a chamber versus a chamber situation. But even in that situation, we have a commitment and a responsibility to pass a comprehensive budget. And it is so important because while in North Carolina we don't have shutdowns, because a few years ago legislation passed that if we don't pass a budget, we revert back to the previous biennium's budget. Everyone knows that prices are continuing to go up. And so that means that if we don't pass a new budget, you don't see raises that account for some of this increase in inflation that we're seeing. So it is very important for us to get this done to make sure that projects don't fall by the wayside, people don't fall behind, and then see that the public sector is no longer a viable opportunity, and to make sure that our schools are not placed behind the eight ball.
Yeah, I don't envy you your job. I think I'm just now coming to the realization I would never trade jobs with you. Frankly, I'm blessed to have this opportunity, and it would be, I think, immensely frustrating to me. But um, as they say here in the South, bless your heart, and I mean that in the genteel way, the nice way, that you and your wife are willing to make those personal sacrifices. Because I know public service comes with a lot of personal sacrifice. It's it's not an easy decision to make, even if distinguished former governors ask you to do it. So thank you for that. You know, we're talking about inflation, which makes me think of the economy. Uh, and this is an area where we do play because we have been saying for well over a decade now that we're trying to redefine economic development through the lens of entrepreneurship, right? I mean, if you want people to become economically emancipated and self sufficient, there's things you can do. There's lots of programs, right? And some go to like just direct assistance and things like that. And safety net programs, which are very necessary, right? I used to say that the distinction between philanthropy and charity is charity exists to end suffering, philanthropy exists to end the causes of suffering, right? That should be the more strategic, longer dollar patient capital that can help you do that. Um, from your vantage point, when we talk economy and economic development, what does that, and I'm not going to ask you to speak for your colleagues, just speaking for yourself, like what does economic development mean to Dante Pittman in his 24th district, seat? How do you see that?
That's a great question, and I have to say the first time I've ever been asked this, so I'm really excited about it. For me, economic development means resources being poured into your community, and those resources include both dollars, but also human capital. I mean, so much of the time we talk about economic development projects and the number of dollars that are going to come, or the number of dollars that are invested in a particular place in the community. And don't get me wrong, that's very important. But it's also important for us to talk about the human capital. What opportunities are we bringing for folks? What next generation mind are we recruiting to bring right here into Wilson, North Carolina? I just do not think we do ourselves enough of a service in talking about the people behind the jobs and the roles that they perform. Because when you're bringing in a talented person into this community, you're not just talking about them fulfilling their role necessarily at their company or their business. You're talking about them being a member of your community. Whether that be your church community, your Rotary Club, they might be the next president of your Chamber of Commerce. They might be the next head of the PTO at the local school. So I just think talking about that human capital is so important when we're looking at economic development. And I can tell you here in this community, that has been where we have seen some of the greatest gains is not just the number of dollars that are being invested here, but the people that we have attracted here and how they are giving back to this community.
Yeah, and I've heard that story, and I'm sure most listeners know well now the incredible national success story that Wilson is, especially with what they did with broadband and how is I mean, I just I didn't even think about this because the first time I was in Wilson, it was, 8, 9 years ago, and so it was pre-COVID, and then I think, "Oh my goodness," I just had this epiphany while we're talking, like, imagine you guys were built for COVID, right? I live in Northern Orange County, where I still had barely dial-up connectivity. So even though everybody, was sent home, I still had to come into the office during much of COVID because I didn't have adequate internet connectivity at my home. Y'all were ready for it, right? And I think these are part of the assets that attract that capital, that human capital you're talking about. I wonder if you might tolerate a slight provocation when we talk business attraction, right? And that investment, you use you see the announcements, oh, company XYZ is going to invest $100 million to build a new factory and there's going to be 200 new jobs in there. I know those are always part of the headline, but my take on that has always been, admittedly, all right, I'm calling myself out, somewhat cynical, because that quote investment, that's just that's what it's going to cost them to build the factory that they need to build the product that they need to sell. It's not a community asset. It's not like your Hispanic voters are going to have their daughter's quinceanera, in the lobby of that new beautiful office building. It's not a community asset. Yes, there are short-term temporary construction jobs that are, I'm sure, welcome in any community, but I've always felt that the price tag that is like always in the lead announcement, so and such to invest $1 billion on this. It's like that $1 billion is going to pay for the brick and mortar and the machinery that they need. It's the cost of, goods sold. It's cost of doing business. It's not necessarily a community asset. I mean, it is in the context of the property taxes that they will pay, although we defer those a lot in these deals, right? So you're getting immediately the traffic, the strain on the infrastructure, where there's water, sewer, electricity, and we're deferring other revenue offsets on that. So I've always been a skeptic. I'm not putting these words in your mouth. So any constituents or your next opponent that might be watching this is not your gotcha moment. This is Tom Rue saying this, but the other fun thing I like to do is, take those announcements and then, you see whether it's a JDIG, incentive package or what. I always like to take the cost, to the state and divide it by the number of jobs that are promised. And I call that a cost per job. And you'll be fascinated to see the variance in that. And I think at that point now, you have at least one metric that you could say, okay, if we are going to throw out a $250 million, incentive package to attract 1,200 jobs, we can pretty much do that assessment. I think then you have an intellectual baseline to say, okay, what else could we do with $250 million? Could we do something that would have a way more efficient job creation engine, right? And now you're smart enough to know where I'm going with this. This is a blatant plug for supporting entrepreneurs and founders because they are our job creators. There was a gentleman that leads a very large, well-known state organization that funds a lot of good and worthy projects. And I remember I had a chance to have dinner with him and I explained to him the data behind what, the job creation that entrepreneurs do and startups do. And he looked at me as if he had just, gotten kind of like the Newton apple to the head and said, as I hear that, I wonder why we don't have an entrepreneurship strategy. And I was like, yes, that's what I want, people to understand because that's what's moving the needle. Unfortunately, they don't have representation because they're your neighbors. They're toiling away in obscurity and you're in the garage or in the den of their home, right? And they're self-funding and they're side hustling for a while until they can get to escape velocity. And I just think they're underappreciated and probably underrepresented in, the day-to-day hand-to-hand combat that is legislating. And so I guess I'm just making a plug here, to the extent that I've moved you in any way, maybe help some of your colleagues understand that the economic impact there is definitely worth, the effort and energy to learn about.
Well, and, I think that I'm in a very fortunate position here for us to have the partnership of an organization like Gig East and our local chamber of commerce that understand exactly what you're talking about. And when I was running last year, that was something that I often talked about was, of course, we want the big, grand opportunities that you land once every so often, but we can't forget about sustaining and supporting the folks that are here with their small businesses or somebody that's got an idea. When I visited classrooms, I told folks I was blown away by the number of students that didn't say, "Oh, I want to be a lawyer or a doctor, this or that," but they had an idea and they said, I'm interested in pursuing this and seeing if this can be my career." And we've got to foster that because if we don't do it here, then they're going to go someplace like New York or Los Angeles or, another great place in the country, but it's not better than Wilson, North Carolina. And so I always tell those folks that we have resources here, and I tell them, consider me to be a resource in that. Is that how do we figure out how to patch together the resources to lift up those folks that have a great idea? They just need a shot at it. And we're fortunate to have some of those partners here locally that are invested in that work.
I think our producer's giving me the wrap it up notice. So what I'm going to say in doing so is kudos to you, sir, because you do understand it and you don't take it for granted. I see some of these, unsung heroes every day in our line of work, and they're just either ignored or just taken for granted or just assumed they're always going to be there. And it would be easy for, in particular, Wilson to do that because you were so ahead of the curve back in the day. But you're absolutely right because just as aggressive as we are in trying to woo, companies to come into the state of North Carolina, I say tongue in cheek, we're starting the companies that some other state will try to woo out of North Carolina at some point. Um, but they'll be less susceptible because they will have been started here, supported here, appreciated here. They'll feel their ties here. This will be home to them. And that's why I think it's it takes a certain intellectual heft to understand that it's a great long-term investment. It's planting trees that will someday shade people that need it. And yeah, I have to say congratulations that you see that. I hope that your understanding that is infectious among your peers and that at some point we can have, a little more honest conversations about what works without regard to which party is the one championing it.
Well, and some of the best ideas I would argue that we are able to get through are the ones that have bipartisan partners in it. And I've talked with some of my colleagues. Look, I'm not just here for Democratic wins. I want wins for North Carolina. And that right now also means having Republican partners. So let's get together on these things and let's think outside of the box. And I say, of course, I'm biased because I come from a place that has done that. But look, we have some of the notes here. How can we translate that from the local to the state perspective? And, it's one of those things that we were talking about earlier about not always being concerned about who gets the credit because, quite frankly, I don't know how they track the numbers in terms of folks that we retain. I know we always hear about the new people moving into North Carolina, and that's great. We want good people to be here, but I also want to retain good people. I don't want it to be just folks coming in the door and then out the door. We want them to plant roots and be true North Carolinians, and we have an opportunity in this state right now to do it.
Yep. I remember when I graduated from boot camp, then we had a 1 star was like our keynote at the mess dress. And I remember 40 some years later, I remember his kind of closing point was, and he said, remember, you can accomplish anything if you don't worry about who gets the credit.
That's right. That's right.
And that has stuck with me and it's been good life advice. So, on that note, as somebody that's just trying to do the right thing without worrying about the credit, I will thank you again, Representative Dante Pittman. Thank you so much for finding time to sit for the podcast. Let me close out by offering a sincere willingness to help you, your office, if you ever want to spitball ideas or alternative thinking around, traditional economic development. We're here at your service, and any of your colleagues on the other side of the aisle. We are, officially nonpartisan. Um, and because of what we do, you can imagine there's a lot of people from both parties that we fund and support. being successful in business it's not a partisan issue. So if we can be helpful to the process, please accept this as a sincere offer to do so.
Well, I appreciate it. It's been a pleasure, and I agree with you. Good ideas don't have a party.
Stay connected with NC Idea on LinkedIn and Facebook, and subscribe to our newsletter for all the latest as we celebrate our 20th year. Catch new episodes of Ecosysteming every other Tuesday. Thanks for tuning in and being a part of this thing of ours.